And therefore, this attainment of the Nibbana element without residue is also called the Khanda Parinibbana. Nibbana consisting in the extinguishing of the process of the five aggregates. Now the question often comes up, what is the state of the Arhat after death? Is it a state of annihilation or non-existence, or a state of eternal existence in some form? The Buddha rejects both of these alternatives. And he says that any attempt to answer this question is inapplicable, invalid. The question, what is the state of the Arhat after death, arises because of an intellectual clinging, a subtle clinging to the idea that the Arhat has a self which must become either eternalized or annihilated. But since the Arhat, or any other being for that matter, cannot be conceived as a self, the state of the Arhat and final Nibbana cannot be conceived as either eternal existence or as annihilation. The Arhat doesn't enter into some state of eternal existence, either as an individual self in some heavenly world, or as a universal self in some impersonalized form. But also, final Nibbana is not a state of annihilation, for there is no self to be annihilated and extinguished. What we call the Arhat is a dependently arisen process of becoming, and the attainment of final Nibbana is a cessation to that beginningless process of becoming. To try to speak of what lies beyond the ending of this process, this is to venture outside the boundaries of conceptualization, outside the boundaries of language. There's a sutta, the 15th sutta of the Digha Nikaya, in which the Buddha says, "In so far only is there any pathway for words, any pathway for language, any pathway for concepts, any sphere of understanding. That is, when there is consciousness together with mind and body process, nama, rupa, and vijnana. When there is no remainder of consciousness with the mind-body process, then there is no pathway for words, no pathway for language, no pathway for concepts." So from this we can see that when the five aggregates, the mind-body processes, then there's no room for language, concepts, or knowledge, nothing to point to and to designate. Here words become totally inadequate and unsatisfactory. The concepts can't penetrate the inconceivable, and the mind can't measure the immeasurable. There are a few interesting sutta passages in which the question of the state of the Arhat after death is raised. In one sutta, the 72nd sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, the wandering ascetic, a non-Buddhist, named Vajjagota, comes to the Buddha, and he says, "Venerable Sir, does the enlightened one, the liberated one, the Arhat, does he exist after death?" The Buddha says, "To say he exists after death, that doesn't apply." Then the wanderer asks, "Then does he not exist after death?" The Buddha says, "Non-existence doesn't apply." The wanderer tries the combination. Does he both exist and not exist after death? The Buddha says, "That doesn't apply." Then he tries the double negation. Does he neither exist nor non-exist after death? The Buddha says, to say he neither exists nor non-exists after death, that doesn't apply. And so the Buddha rejects all these four alternatives. The wanderer says, "I'm puzzled. I don't understand." Then the Buddha uses an analogy. He says, suppose there's a fire. The fire burns and blazes in dependence upon its fuel, upon the sticks and logs. Now, if the fire doesn't get any further fuel when it uses up the old fuel, then it goes out. And suppose we ask, when the fire goes out, where does it go? Does it go to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west? The wanderer says, none of these apply. All of these are inapplicable. The fire has simply gone out. The Buddha says it's the same way with the Arhat. The dependently arisen process of becoming has come to an end. However, in case the idea that the final Nibbana is a state of non-existence comes to the mind, the Buddha dispels this with what he says further. He says that the liberated one, the Tathagata, freed from reckoning by way of the five aggregates, by way of form, feelings, the perceptions, the mental formations, and consciousness. The Tathagata is deep, immeasurable, and unfathomable, like the great ocean, not to be conceived by the finite concepts of the mind, not to be measured by the measuring devices of the mind. There's another similar sutta which is spoken by a nun, a bhikkhuni, named Kema. Kema comes to see King Basenadi Kosala, the king of the state of Kosala. And King Basenadi asks the same questions about the state of the Tathagata after death. And to each of these, the nun Kema says, that is not declared by the Buddha. The Buddhist doesn't say that the Arhat exists eternally after death, that he becomes non-existent, that he both exists and doesn't exist, that he neither doesn't exist nor non-exists after death. The king is puzzled and asks for an explanation. The bhikkhuni Kema says, do you have, O Majesty, do you have a minister, a treasurer, or an accountant who is able to measure the waters in the ocean, to say that there's so much water in the ocean? The king says, no, I don't. And so, in the same way, Bhikkhuni says, the Tathagata, the enlightened one, free from reckoning by way of the five aggregates, is like the great ocean,